I just wanted to... That's all right, it's moved again.
Sorry, Sue.
I just wanted to show you the two covers of the versions that I'm actually going to look at, just to give you some concept and idea of where I'm coming from. This is Jack Zipf's latest book of his translation of the originals of the Brothers Grimm that's only just recently come out. And this is a group of fairy tales that Jan Wade put together for young Australians. And I just want to look specifically at those and, in a cultural sense, unpack some of the ideas and the way they're presented, and then consider the effectiveness of them. Because it is a complex thing to do, and for it to remain, contain an authenticity about what they're trying to do. Before I actually focus though on those, I just want to consider briefly why Hansel and Gretel, and what constitutes the essence of the stories, the implications and consequences for transforming the tale, and as Marina Warner calls it, refers to it, constructing a second order narrative and seeing what sort of things come out of it. And one of the criteria that she talks about is that they need to maintain a fidelity to the past and provide an accumulated wisdom of the past. So I just want to look at it from those sorts of things. The actual tale's one I've been interested in for as long as I can remember. I don't know why, when I was so young, what it was that attracted me, but I was scared of the dark forest and the finding of the jewellery at the end. All those sorts of things came together as this amazing, sort of spooky but wonderful story. It's only now, later in life, that I realised there were so many things in there to resonate with people, and that continue to resonate regardless of the time or the age that you actually read or come across these stories. I think firstly it's the profound psychological depths that are explored so meticulously, for example, by Bettelheim von Franz. They take different aspects, but they look at those sorts of things. And the fact that they're still relevant to life today, with the socio-cultural themes of poverty, emotional blackmail, female power, family relationships, deliberate abandonment of children, the predation of children through offering of enticements and security, and the sheer resilience of individuals as they survive some of these things. Okay. So this is basically the introduction, then I want to look briefly at the techniques for transforming tales, then actually have an analysis of Jan Wade's version, and then try and pull that together for you. So the techniques. Sorry, I'm really nervous. The whole notion of a folk tale and a fairy tale, as Warner said, they've kind of melded, and it's hard to pull them apart. So there's not a lot of fairiness, for want of a better way of putting it, in Hansel and Gretel, but there is a lot of folk in it. And I think that if you're going to make a genuine effort to do a cross-cultural version, then you have to look at ways of making it into that sort of folk genre as well. The sorts of transformations, Angela Carter, for one, was absolutely wonderful at doing it. She had this amazing way of reframing, how did she put it, to put new wine in old bottles so that they would explode, which I just think is a beautiful way of explaining it, and that the old bottles were still necessary because she couldn't create the fantastic pyrotechnics without them. And I think that's the essence of having that original there, and then it's what you do with them. And some of them are more successful than others. In terms of Hansel and Gretel, it's really interesting to look across a whole lot of different versions of it. So Strauss and Gwen Strauss and Anne Sexton have both written poetry about it. The Strauss version, she gives voice to the father and how he feels about abandoning his children. Anne Sexton, she begins with a really explicit and frightening notion of cannibalism, and then she retells the story and then in verse, and then she comes back at the end and pulls out some of the ideas of the cannibalism at the end. Emma Donoghue has written a collection of books called Kissing the Witch, Old Tales in New Skins, and she does a completely different narrative that looks at the story from Gretel's perspective, and it's quite different, but it maintains a very dark psychological level and has a lot of indictment of the societal norms of the old tale, and the language is really innovative and it's different, but it has its own particular way and its own original wisdom incorporated into it. So they work really well. There's another book by Sarah Maitland, and she explores forests, and she combines nature writing, imaginative writing, and she puts together, her and her son tour all these old forests around England, and then she puts together her own fiction, and they tell the stories and how they relate, and then she makes her own. So she wrote a sequel for Hansel and Gretel in the same kind of way, and all of those have been really, really successful. Next one, please. Keep going up there, works through a lot of things. Okay, so the text form, the actual focus that they take, the voice that they use, and the next one is the artwork, which is where the majority, I don't know, I've probably got maybe 20 versions, I think, of picture books of Hansel and Gretel, and all of them are totally different because of the artwork, and I've just put together, just quickly so you can sort of see how differently, for example, the witch is portrayed. This one here comes from a Canadian version, and you never see the witch's face. You only see this outline here. This one's by Zelinsky, and it's quite a traditional painterly style of artwork. The one up the top by Ray, that's she's almost like a voodoo witch in that one. This one in the triangle is from Anthony Brown's version, which of course was written as being in the time of Thatcherism and the poverty and those sorts of things. And the far one is by Marshall, which I find very intriguing, that in a time of famine, when people have nothing to eat, you have a well-endowed witch, and that she's wearing red. So just by even reading the pictures, you get totally different ideas of how these stories come together. So the reframing can be through those, the way in which a cottage comes through, it's decorated in the different sorts of ways, the sort of forests that's used, all those kinds of things. And I've just been through those with you of what some of the successful examples are. So what happens in Jan Wayne's version? What does she use? Well, she uses visuals, different ideas of structures and setting, and I'm just going to look at some of those and try and unpack them a little bit, where she makes numerous changes to the original and sets it in the present day Australian landscape. She did these in 1992, so already you're looking at 20 odd years ago. Doesn't take long, does it? The time to go. The immediate and obvious difference of the setting of the visual are the way she decorates. In fact, she almost smothers her retelling with plenty of iconic Australiana in both text and illustrations. Initially, the children take shelter under baobab trees, and then you've got a landscape filled with wildlife. So you've got the koala, the kangaroo, the echidna, the frill-necked lizard, gecko, echidna, and redback spider. They're all there. The bird life is equally prolific. Crow, cockatoo, galah, kookaburra. The weather's hot and dry, and the countryside's in the grip of drought, which is why there's so little food. Now, some of that has a certain authenticity to it. The actual characters provide a strong focus for the green and gold, because Hansel, I think, next one I've got a picture of that. No, sorry, no, it's towards the end. It's all right, go back. Hansel has a T-shirt which is gold and green, and then the big green Australia across the front of his T-shirt. Gretel's got a wattle-sprigged hat. She's got green and gold shorts and gold bangles round here. Even the witch is to a degree the stereotypical items of clothing, and she's dressed in green and black, maybe a symbolic representation for an Australian witch, I'm not sure, but on her head she has a black hat with the corks hanging round it, and a big bumper-related sticker that says, "I crossed the Nullarbor," across the hat. So that's emblazoned across there. And then she's wearing a pair of patched Ugg boots on her feet. Of course, when they find the jewels at the end, and this is just sort of fairly quick summary, it does include opals, and we have lamingtons, pavlovas, strawberries and kiwi fruit to make the witch's cottage, along with barley sugar and striped candy. Now, while all of these are common, almost stereotypical aspects of Australian culture and life, the way in which they're cramped into such a small frame, because it's just the stories that goes across about 4 pages, and it just has all this artwork, the stories there, and then all this artwork around it with everything Australiana, all piled into it. To me, it verges on presenting a tale that's selling or promoting Australia to the outside world through some already most familiar representations, more than capturing any sort of essence of 2 starving children thrown onto their own resources during suffering from a cruel and frightening experience. So it's totally at odds with where the original folk tale came from. I think such representations do fail in many ways to generate the primacy and the intensity of the fear evident from the original version of the story, because it foregrounds cultural symbols rather than aspects of the human dilemma. And that's what I mean about, as a folk tale, it doesn't work in that particular way. Her purpose probably was not to do that, but I just think it's worth looking at how we are reinventing, as Australians, how we are reinventing how we see some of these stories. Structurally, there's nuances in the way that the language is used, in the way that the events are selected, the sorts of vocabulary, the foregrounding of aspects of characters, the cultural context. I think I've... Here we go. Yeah. Oh no, there you're it. No, go back. That's right. Sorry. I got there. And cultural context and setting, and the ways in which the symbols are selected and used are quite big differences. Often they work. They work quite well, but I think the way this is done, it doesn't really do justice to the kind of story that Hansel and Gretel in particular is. The language used has a subtle and powerful effect. It starts off, so in Grimm's version, it goes from the edge of a large forest to alone in the forest, to the middle of the forest, farther into the forest, then deeper into the forest until they came to a place they'd never seen before, to eventually losing their way in the great wilderness for 3 days. So you get that progressive movement of the language as it moves forward. Ultimately, this forest is a place where there's always a possibility that the children are going to be torn apart by the wild animals. Whereas in Wade's depiction, there's none of this extra subtlety. It begins, the forest begins as a hazy outline of a distant blue gum forest, which becomes a great forest, and finally a gloomy enchanted forest. So it goes very rapidly, this transformation of the Australian forest into a gloomy enchanted forest with cool ferns and bracken and a well-kept path leading to a cottage in a sunlit clearing. And it's worth noting that at no point does Wade actually refer to it as the bush. which to my way of thinking of culturally Australian, we don't really talk about forests a lot. We tend to refer to it as the bush. And it's a much more familiar term. Overall, the reader's given no indication either in text or illustration that the children in this forest are in any real danger from the reasonably friendly-looking Australian bush creatures. It's only when they meet the witch that we see a snake and a redback spider. So all their fears are condensed into this one experience. And so there's this green and gold snake wrapped around the spiders, around the witch's hat. When talking about the witch, the Grimm's brothers describe her as a small ancient woman who crept out the door, which is very much in line with that view of the old crone, the magic world, the woman who had magic, create, do those sorts of things, comes through, whereas, and who entices the children in to the house with the words, "Well now, dear children, where have you come from? Come inside with me. You'll have a good time." The other hand waged the witch is immediately a fearful sight. Her skin was a pale green colour and she sniffed the children with her long warty nose, which she depended on, as her cold, cruel eyes were very short-sighted, who straight away throws a magic rope to hold them tight. And then she's got a little additional rhyme that comes up very quickly. "Today's the day I'll boil the brat. I'll eat him now, skinny or fat." So you have this whole different way of how the witch is there. What it's really doing is further developing that focus on the witch as one who's all about action rather than enticement. So it loses the subtlety of that original witch who's very clever at getting the children in. She's got this and she entices them in. And when she takes them in, she gives them this beautiful food. She puts them into beds with clean sheets and all that sort of... No messing with the Australian witch. You get lassoed and pulled in and that's it. Similarly, the choice of words highlights fundamentally different approaches and the themes developed within these stories. For example, Zipf's translations use words like predicament, abandon, wild beast, pitiful tears, anger, yield, gobbled, wilderness, lure, and shove, while Wade chooses words like worried, wept, trudged, strange, delicious, stupid, fat, and push. And they just don't have the same impact as words as the ones that the Grimm brothers were using. These semantic choices that the writers use convey quite different emphases on the themes and story details. I think the way the Grimms use words, they provide a focus on the emotional complexities of the relationships, the fear, the darkness of the children's predicament, while Wade uses a much lighter touch and places the meeting with the witch at the foreground of her story. So it's more on the action side rather than the emotional, psychological. The children also live with their parents, a poor grazier. To me that seems a little bit of a contradiction in terms. I know graziers go through tough times, but normally the graziers are categorised as the better to do. If it had been a share farmer, or even just a farmer, but the fact that it was a grazier, it just seems to me that it's not quite there, and his wife. And there's often ambivalence in the versions between the mother and the stepmother. In this initial translation, it is the mother all the way through. There isn't a stepmother. And in this story of Wade, she keeps her mother too. But the main difference is the father is there in both stories. The mother disappears in the Grimm story. The children return home to the mother and father in the Australian version. So what Wade's done, I suppose, is choose to maintain a tight nuclear family structure for her whole story, so that it begins and ends with no overall disruption to the family. And this structure preserves that safe circular narrative which we have so often, particularly for young children, where they leave home, have an adventure, and they come home safely. So it maintains quite a different shape structurally from the others. Probably though for me, the key difference is the way that this reworking begins with a different premise from the older tale, in that when the children realise their parents are desperate for food, they leave the family home, they overhear the parents talking, they leave the family home of their own accord with the intention of finding help for them. They become lost and they're captured by the witch. When they choose to initiate their own action of leaving home, it changes the whole way in which the narrative unfolds. So, in deleting the abandonment of the children by their parents, which is what happens in the Grimm's tale, Wade shuts down one important component of the older version. Given that this abandonment is an abdication of parental responsibility, where the mother initiates and carries out the final abandonment of the children and the father, and the father is situated to choose between the children and his wife, so you have that whole emotional blackmail issue. That comes out beautifully in some of the picture books with the way and the body language between the woodcutter and his wife. It's interesting to look at. It's a crucial aspect of the original version. So I think failure to include these in the text absolves the parents of any responsibility for the children being alone in the forest. The children are there by choice, and so this severely limits the strength of the emotional engagement of readers as they respond to what is basically the abuse of children that comes through from the Grimm's version. At the same time, children becoming lost in the Australian bush is not new, and it's something that resounds, as Sophie was talking about, loss and the Pied Piper and the children disappearing. It's a very, very powerful theme. However, does it actually work in this case? Well, I don't actually think it does. There's no evidence in the way it's written of any of the drama or the impact that such an occurrence would have on a family or a community, and nor does it deal with important themes related to such an event. It just sort of buzzes around. The children go away, they get lost, but we have no indication that this has any repercussions in any emotional or powerful way with the rest of the story. I think if Wade's version is to be truly an Australian fairy tale, then it needs to capture more elements of the human drama that are embedded in such an event. Also of note is the fact that in the original tale, the children find their own way home, which changes as the story goes along over time. But in Wade's version, they rely on the kookaburra, who's been under a spell cast by the witch, and he guides them home. So that difference also modifies the theme of resilience, in that the children don't get to find their own way home. They don't bounce back in the same way. They still need somebody to support and help them. So they have to have that outside assistance. So overall, how does it measure up? Firstly, as an effective second-order narrative, and secondly, as an authentic example of an Australian fairy story. As a second-order narrative, it diverges fundamentally from the cultural ideals of the original version, and that's fine. There's not a problem with that. But I think maybe it doesn't really preserve a fidelity to the past in capturing some of the important aspects of Australian folklore, and it doesn't really provide an accumulating wisdom from the past. There really is no learning or little story tucked underneath that is usually embedded in the folk tales. I think it lacks the psychological and emotional effect of the original, and it doesn't do justice to the idea of children lost in the Australian bush. It's presented more as an action-adventure tale where the key event is the meeting with the witch and returning home to a cosy nuclear family with a fortune. Secondly, I think as far as measuring up as a genuine Australian folk tale, it tries too hard in many ways to include too much surface-level Australiana without any serious attempt to capture important aspects of Australian culture that has its roots in the fidelity of the past and providing a source of accumulated wisdom. Its setting throws together dry brown paddocks, baobab trees, blue gum forests indiscriminately. So it's not kind of authentic in any one part of Australia or any one forest or anything like that. But in doing that, I don't think it does justice to the genuine power of the Australian landscape. I mean, it is a very powerful landscape, and I think it has huge potential in developing our own Australian folk tales and working through them. It all comes back, I guess, to the notion of why they've written them, who they think their audience are, and their fundamental purposes. So if the intention was to write a cute, entertaining yarn for young children, and given the tale of the book, Tales of Australian Folk Tales for young children, that could possibly be the case. And then, in that respect, it could be seen as successful. However, for me as a reader, and everyone's entitled to their own opinions about this, it doesn't really measure up in terms of a second-order narrative of Hansel and Gretel, because it just misses those key aspects of what I think, and what a lot of the critics say a fairy tale needs, or a folk tale needs, to really encompass where it's actually coming from. And as I said, I think to attempt an Australian folk tale, it just tries a bit too hard to be a bit of both, and it doesn't actually achieve either. Thank you very much.
Mum had to stop reading it to me because I kept letting